Welcome everyone, we'll get started shortly. You can grab some water or a snack while you wait. Maybe move to the music. Get started in just a few minutes. All right, everyone. So we are going to get started. So welcome. I know people will continue to trickle in. Welcome and thank you for joining us for our 2023 Fireside Chat style webinar, Supporting Indigenous Communities, Cultural Nuances, and Thoughtful Impact. I'm Sherilyn Seeley, the Senior Program Manager for Grantmakers in the Arts. So before we begin our 75-minute Fireside Chat style webinar, let's take a minute to just review some of the Zoom features so you can have an optimal experience with us today. So if you would like your experience to include live captioning, you can look toward the bottom of your screen. I'm kind of starting with the bottom bullet, moving upward. But you can look toward the bottom of your screen, find the CC icon, that's closed captioning. And you can click and select show subtitles. So that's the first thing. And if you have any questions for our tech team during the webinar, during the Fireside Chat, you can send a message to LGC Tech, there are two, and they'll be happy to assist you with anything that you might need tech-wise. And if you have any questions for each other, right, you're kind of chatting with some of the folks who are also in the room and just kind of sharing celebrations or encouragement, you can put that in the chat. But if you have questions for the presenters during the Fireside Chat, you can use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen and you can select that and submit questions. We will take all of the questions at the very end. I'm keeping track. So if we don't address it right away, don't think we forgot about you. We're waiting toward the end because we will have a Q&A section, okay? We just ask that if you're going to put questions in the chat, questions in the Q&A section, just be specific for who the question is for if you want to specify to a particular person so that I can direct it to that particular person. All right. So now that we've gotten our logistics out of the way, we're here. So one of the questions that we always encourage the sector to consider is how can funders fund more equitably and more thoughtfully, right? And because we know that when looking at arts and culture funding that's going towards ALAANA communities, data continues to reflect a collective and ongoing need that there needs to be more funding towards ALAANA communities. And but at the same time, when we disaggregate the data, it's also very important to have very culturally specific and tiered funding toward specific communities within the ALAANA, I guess, umbrella, right? And when we think about ALAANA, we're thinking African, Latinx, or Latino or Latina, Latine, Asian, Native American, and Arab. So that's kind of like what that acronym stands for. Okay, and we acknowledge that there are some that might not fit into that one of those names necessarily, but we're thinking also, BIPOC community, just so that you have that context. And so in this particular Fireside Chat style webinar, we're going to discuss the needs and the nuances of Indigenous communities in the United States, on Turtle Island, and globally. The Indigenous community is not a monolith, and so funding strategies should not be monolithic either, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that today. And as we were kind of preparing for this Fireside Chat, we were considering some of the following questions. What are the unique factors that funders should consider when supporting Indigenous artists? What types of questions should funders be able to answer before they share out an RFP? And what pro tips, right, might artists recommend to funders for their grant panelists vetting process, right? What are the details that some funders might overlook? And so those are some of the broader questions we'll be addressing. We'll go into some of the nitty-gritty details. And in order to answer those questions, we are so glad to have with us today 3 incredible speakers: Heather Bruegl, historian, Indigenous consultant, and lecturer; Joseph Pierce, associate professor for the Department of Hispanic Languages and Literature at Stony Brook University; Jolene Rickard, visual historian, artist, and curator. So we are going to dive right in. You can see our lovely speakers on our screen right now. And just for starters, can you take a minute to introduce yourselves? I'm going to start with you, Jolene.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. My name is Jolene Rickard, and I'm actually from the Tuscarora Nation, which is the 6th nation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. I'm actually speaking to you from my home territory, although I also work at Cornell University, which is in Gaikono or Cayuga territory. And I work as a historian in the history of art department, but I have been a practicing artist in parallel with this for many years, and also curator. And so thank you for the invitation to be here, and looking forward to the conversation with Joe and also with Heather. And I'd just like to thank the organization for demonstrating, I think, and doing a really great job, even in preparing us for this conversation, as a kind of best example of how to approach this. So thanks, Sherilyn, for that.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jolene. All right, we'll kick it over to you, Heather.
Hi, my name is Heather Bruegl. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and a first-line descendant Stockbridge Munsee. I currently am living in the homelands of the Three Fires Council, the Odawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi peoples, right here in the heart of downtown Detroit. So I lived in my homelands for about 1.5 years and just recently moved back to the Midwest here, where I'm originally from. I kind of, do a lot of different things. A lot of my work intersects. I'm a historian by training. I focus in on early colonial and Indigenous history, but I also speak out about issues within Indian country, things that affect all of us. And one of my favorite things is creating inclusive spaces and telling those fuller narratives of history that we oftentimes miss. So that's what I really love to do, and just kind of help bring equity across the board. And I am so honored that I was asked by Sherilyn to be part of this. So thank you so much, and super excited to be in conversation with Jolene and my dear friend Joseph. So looking forward to it.
Amazing. Thanks, Heather. All right, Joseph, you're up.
Osionigad. My name is Joseph Pierce, and I'm a citizen of Cherokee Nation. I am an associate professor at Stony Brook University, where I am the only Indigenous faculty member at the entire university, of more than 2,500 faculty members. I'm also a writer about art and institutions, and am a curator of a series called Knowledge of Wounds, which is an Indigenous and queer and trans focused presenting platform for Native artists on Turtle Island, as well as Abya Yala or Latin America and Australia and the Pacific. So like all of us, I think we have our hands in different pots and are always sort of moving around in different spheres. So I'm also very grateful to be here.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Joseph. And before we dive into the meat of our conversation, I also want to give a shout out to Creatives Rebuild New York, who also had a large part to play in all of us kind of coming together and having this conversation. So really excited about this today. So for starters, kind of acknowledging the title, right, of our Fireside Chat. The first big question that I'm going to share out that you can all kind of speak to is funding Indigenous communities really as nuanced as one might think? Very broad. Full stare.
Is it or can it be?
I mean,
Is
I
that the
guess we
question?
could. Yeah, I mean, I asked, is it? But can it be?
Okay. No, obviously not, or we wouldn't be here.
That's right.
But I mean, let me just since I think that's one of the reasons that some like we all worked with them as part of the sort of evaluation process, and some of the things that we saw there were
Oh, Joseph, I think you're cutting out. We're not able to hear you. All right, while Joseph is getting his internet back, Jolene or Heather, do you have any thoughts on that question? How nuanced or not, just kind of broadly, funding for Indigenous communities can be?
I think funding is a very blunt instrument right now.
Okay.
And that it will take some time, and I think education to actually develop the framework. And I think it's more systemic than, I don't think it's the fault of foundations or granting agencies. I think it's actually much deeper, that it's difficult to understand how to locate Indigenous peoples within, an absence of acknowledgement of the Americas as settler states. I think it's more profound than recognize, being willing to recognize our place in the Americas and to deal with lateral aggression. I mean, I think there's there's many issues that are factors here that really go beyond, I think, the rubric of what funding can do. But, today we're here to discuss what funding can do, but I think we need to begin to think about how do we support projects that get at the deeper issues.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. And I think we're also going to talk about some of the deeper issues later on. So that's great. Thank you for that, Jillian. Joseph, you're back. Please pick up where you left off. Welcome.
My internet was so stable, and then just decided to have a little meltdown. No, I was thinking that some of the really basic things about who we are, how there are more than 500 different federally recognized tribes just within the United States, much less in Canada, and then how these different types of designations historically have affected our communities and what it means to be a citizen of a nation versus someone who's not a citizen of a nation, and federally recognized versus state recognized versus not recognized at all. All of these are really complex political understandings that I think most people in general don't have. And then when it comes to arts fundings, a lot of times that's merely a reflection of this general sense of lack of understanding of these nuances. And I think that as a baseline, there's a lot of self-educating that people can do. Like Indigenous people are complex, but we're not like a complete mystery to the world. And so taking a specific interest in how can you approach Indigenous communities means really insisting on you educating yourself about what happened in order for these different groups to exist in the ways that they do where they are. And so that has to do with land, that has to do with how all of our land was stolen, or how some land was stolen and some was ceded by treaties. And so like it can get really complex, but that doesn't mean that it's unknowable. So I think that's one point that I want to be really clear on. It's yes, these issues are complex and we have internal divisions, and just like any community, we have differences of opinion and differences of thought and approach, but that doesn't mean that it's somehow incomprehensible.
I can appreciate that accountability, Joseph. Heather, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I was just building on what Joseph said, and even on what some of Jolene said. It's like we don't exist in a vacuum. And I think when it comes to funding, I think what happens is people don't know where to start. They don't know how to approach tribal communities or tribal people. And so just there's this education that has to take place beforehand, because it's totally doable. And it's something that can be done if people just put on their thinking caps, like Joseph said, and do that self-education first. I think it's really, really important. And sorry, I think my dog was barking, so if you heard that, I apologize.
No, it's good. All right, that's fantastic. And I think too, like some of the conversations that we've had kind of leading up to this point, having this chat, and it kind of came out just now, it's important to be thinking about, once you've gotten yourself to a point of education where you can approach a particular Indigenous community, kind of sub, I guess, community within the larger, thinking about like why are you, like, what's the goal behind the funding, right? Like what's your target? Like, is it just to give money away? Like what are you trying to get at when you're sharing out this funding? So I really appreciate that. And I think you kind of spoke to that a little bit, Jolene, as we started. Yeah, I see some wheels turning. Do you have any responses to that before
Can I have one more thing? I bet Jolene does too.
Sure. Yeah.
But I was just thinking about this, that DE and I, for example, it's an industry. This is an industry we're talking about, and the giving of money away is by now like essentially a requirement for organizations who want to have a type of ethical stance toward minoritized populations. This can become patronizing very quickly. And one of the things that, I think we're talking about is that type of engagement of treating Indigenous people as minorities or as part of a part of a DE&I sort of initiative really runs the risk of repeating the very same power dynamics of sort of tutelage or of sort of charity that was established with colonialism, with schools and boarding schools and the like. And so it completely disregards the fact that Indigenous nations are sovereign nations. They are peoples, and our peoplehood and our nationhood matters in a very distinct way than sort of the racialized view of Indigenous as as an ethnic group. So it's that part of it, I think, really needs to become more prominent in how we think about what relationships presenting organizations and funding organizations can have with Indigenous communities, because we're not just a race, right? Like this is actually up in the Supreme Court right now with the
Right.
Indigenous Child Welfare Act case, that Indigenous peoples are not a race in the same way as Black people have been racialized in the United States, but are sovereign Indigenous nations that have nation-to-nation relationships with the United States. So that makes it a political identity in addition to an ethnic or racial one, if not primarily a political one.
Thanks for that, Joseph. Heather, Jolene, did you?
If it was, and this is, I think, one of the fundamental divides or issues in thinking about structuring funding, in that Sherilyn mentioned these specific relationships that we have with government. And so, you know, and I think it's popular to minimize the importance of those relationships, especially if you're not recognized. But what I would say is that what is recognition? You know, I think this is something that we have to understand, that within our own communities, we have mechanisms for recognizing each other, and that each people's has a way in which we know is a part of our communities. Often I find myself asking people today, when they're claiming ascendancy, or when they're claiming that they're part of a community, which is, of course, you know, we get hundreds of applications at Cornell of people who've checked the box and said they're Native American. And what does that mean today, right?
Yeah.
We're using the language of Indigenous today, and Indigenous even has like even more complicated impact when we think about it globally.
Yeah.
And I do, you know, and I think we have to have more conversations about this in order to be inclusive, but at the same time, not to take away from the very peoples that are continually putting forward these the cultural constructs that we get from our ancestors that we're moving into the future. And so we wouldn't be here today as Native, Indigenous, Indian, Tuscarora, Oneida, Cherokee, if our peoples didn't specifically decide that we want to maintain these spaces and we want to maintain our cultural identities, you know. And so there's some people that are careening towards wanting to be a part of the nation states or the colonial states that we are surrounded by. But there are peoples who are also, I think, in our communities saying, you know, that we are really working towards maintaining the principles and values and histories that our peoples have carried forward. And so, you know, this is one of those questions about what project are you funding and what's it part of? Are you funding a project that's part of late capitalism and is, you know, something that is, you know, not set up to support the continuance of Indigenous spaces, but on the surface looks like it's being inclusive? And often I read a lot of grant applications that I feel teeter in that space. And that they've tacked on a Native consultant or an Indigenous consultant in order to go after a pool of funding that's meant or that is structured as being part of a call for, most often it's really a call for, diversity or inclusion, with Indigenous as one of the constituent groups. And I think that, we all have to work harder to really raise the ethical standard to recognize when it's not an Indigenous project. When the research application is not an Indigenous project, but it's tacked on somebody that, is a Native or Indigenous person as a consultant. And so, I think that this is, one of the most flagrant abuses in this category. And so, then it becomes for me, it becomes the discussion, well, what are our priorities, right? What is it our communities are really trying, what is it we need? What kind of consultation does it take to actually establish what we need, what we're thinking about? And we don't all have to need or think about the same things. I'm not suggesting that. But I just think that there has to be a way to rethink even the call for funding or how funding is structured to really address the needs in our communities. Because it's sometimes I'm thinking the fit isn't very good.
Yeah.
I think I got a little off target there. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. We're going in that direction, so like you're good. But Heather, did you want to chime in before we move forward?
I'm good. I don't think I have anything else to add to that.
Okay. Thanks for that, Heather. All right. Yeah. So kind of going back to some of what you already mentioned, this idea of being U.S. federally recognized or not, and how that impacts support, because we're here, we've got a lot of funders who are attending on the call, and we want to kind of suss out and kind of unpack from the artist perspective, of course, you all, what is the responsibility of the funder? And Joseph, you kind of started talking about that earlier as well. Like, first, get to know the community that you want to reach out to, but let's kind of go a little bit deeper there.
I mean, I think from the beginning, there's a question of the specifics of federal recognition are important because tribes have been unilaterally dissolved. Their governments have been just poof, erased, and then reinstated. Tribes have become federally recognized more recently, and there's a set of criteria that the government uses to determine who gets this federal recognition. We can debate, ad nauseum the nuances of those criteria, but at the end of the day, that is a system that, while it is imperfect, is used by many of the tribes themselves in order to determine a type of relationship with the state. Each tribe has its own criteria for its own membership, right? But and that is independent of federal recognition. So like I have a citizenship enrollment in Cherokee Nation, and then I have a federal card that says my blood quantum from that, and that has nothing to do with my Cherokee citizenship, specifically in the case of Cherokees, because we don't use blood quantum. Other tribes do. And so that's another thing, is that each tribe has its own method of determining membership, right? Citizenship in that nation. What that means then is you can't just say, well, this person's Cherokee and this person's Navajo and this person's Tuscarora, so they're all going to be the same. No, each of those nations has its own methods of determining who belongs and who doesn't belong. And so you really need to become cognizant of and more aware of those membership criteria. And so you understand what someone says when they're saying they're a citizen of this nation, which means therefore that you can understand when someone is saying, I'm a descendant of, which is something that we're seeing more and more, which I have problems with. It's tricky, but you know, just to be specific about the case of Cherokees, which is, you know, so as to not talk about other people. According to Cherokee Nation, there's really no such thing as an unenrolled Cherokee person. To Cherokee Nation, you're either enrolled or you're not enrolled. And you're either enrolled in one of the 3 federally recognized tribes or you're not. Now, that has come with the history of tons and tons of people claiming to be Cherokee when they're not. And so other tribes have different histories, and not everyone claims to be, you know, like Elizabeth Warren and have some sort of like Cherokee great-grandmother, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's true.
Yeah.
This is the bullshit that we have to deal with.
Right.
So you've got, you know, these nuances of membership. Now, when it comes to funding, okay, so you're a funder and you've got someone who's saying, well, I'm not enrolled, but I'm a descendant of Cherokee Nation, and to you, that makes sense. But if you actually ask Cherokee Nation, they say that category doesn't exist. That person, that doesn't exist. So what can funders do is, in my opinion, look at what that tribal nation uses to determine citizenship. And if someone is claiming to be a member of that community without adhering to those norms of citizenship, then you need to have a mechanism for sort of documenting the community ties that this person may or may not have. So, you know, if you're not enrolled in this nation, then perhaps there's some really compelling reason why this is the case. You need to be able to tell that story about why that's the case, you know, because I've, you know, I'll just say one more thing and then I'll shut up. But like I was recently, I live in Brooklyn. I was recently, I saw this, you know, a presenter was presenting unenrolled, you know, this like specifically presenting unenrolled Indigenous people. And I know, you know, that there are reasons and it's complicated but like this person that they were presenting has been documented as not Indigenous at all. And so they're talking about having sort of like Black and Indigenous solidarity. And my argument was, you don't have any Indigenous people in this Black and Indigenous solidarity because there's no Indigenous person present. So you can't have Black and Indigenous solidarity without Indigenous people. And, you know, I'm not gonna like name names about this, but it's like, these things set us back. And so my suggestion is for presenters to understand and funding organizations to understand that enrollment is the determination of the tribe, not you, but the tribe. And yet there may be some ways in which people have documented or community relations, or people who are not from the United States, right? That where federal recognition doesn't exist. In Australia, it doesn't exist. In Latin America, it doesn't exist. So you have to be able to document your relationships with communities in ways that are acceptable to that community, which means you have to be pretty dexterous with how you go about determining this, but it can be done.
Did you want to say anything? Because I was just going to maybe express Joseph's idea in a different way. Could I take a moment and do that?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks. And so I think, you know, a lot of people get really angry about what Joseph has just laid out there, because they see it as an acceptance of coloniality of the government to actually use the federal government as a measure. And I don't think that's, and I just want to be careful that that's not what he said. He said that we have our own ways of doing this within our communities, but then there's also the federal system. But if we take away the authority of those two systems, I think what being a part of a community, part of a nation, part of a territory, part of a people, that needs to be taken more seriously. And I that's what I'm hearing, Joseph, when you call for this, because there are a lot of people that speak for me at present, and they don't have the ability to do that, but they somehow have gained the authority to do that. And so what does it actually mean to be a part of a people's, and so each one of us has a story, right? And so I'm lucky because my story is actually documented in my grandfather's biography, his autobiography. And it tells of how our people fought, were dispossessed, were pushed, how we settled, how we negotiated, how we created these diplomatic relationships with other states, and how we survived at this point in time. But it also means that we carry with us an understanding of the way in which we think about this world. And some people today are using the language of place-based knowledge. And so Indigenous peoples do have a perspective, a deep perspective of what it means to be from this part of the world, since our people think of it as since the beginning of time. And so what is the knowledge that we're supporting here, right? Are we supporting people that are struggling with, working with, trying to maintain this, keep it moving forward, trying to discover it? Or are we seeking to empower people that have no connection to this, but want to speak for it because it's the trend at present? And so I think, and so I guess I might approach it or think of it in two ways, as far as eliminating the feign of innocence, right? That I didn't know, right? And the other piece of it is, you can't put this burden on our nations because they are already besieged with hundreds of requests for different kinds of things, of which vetting an individual who's claiming to be part of their community or our community, who is handling that request? And so this is where, as a larger community, a larger arts community, I'm very impressed with the rigor in the settler state of Canada right now, that there is an informal network of how to solicit this information, especially since the Canadian government changed the status of what is considered Métis. And so, informing oneself and keeping up on those debates, I think, is something one can do. And there's an organization called the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association. And in this organization, which has a website, there's allied and Indigenous scholars that are working on these topics. And so if your library isn't networked to kind of help you do this research, there's an organization to lead you to scholars who are looking at this carefully, because one of the biggest areas of abuse is actually in academia. And so there are scholars that are really trying to put forward information so that we can work on this together in an integral way. And so I'm hoping that could be helpful. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks, Jolene. And then we have a link that was put into the chat by Eddie, our president and CEO. So thank you for that, Eddie. All right, Heather.
Yeah, so I think this is the part of the conversation that is extremely nuanced. While the funding is nuanced, absolutely, but that plays into this. And I could spend hours talking about Indigenous identity and enrollment and blood quantum. Like, I don't know why I'm obsessed with it, but I am. And so while while listening to Joseph and to Jolene, I thought about when we did our introductions and how I introduced myself, that I'm a citizen of, right? That holds power. Joseph mentioned the ICWA case that is in front of the Supreme Court, which we may actually have a decision this week. I'm not sure on that yet, but we may have a decision this week. And one of the arguments of that case is that it discriminates on the basis of race. However, as stated earlier, Indigenous peoples in the United States, we're not race-based, we're political entities, because we do have that citizenship in federally recognized tribal nations. That also then brings into question state recognized and non-recognized. And I know we've talked a lot about that around here too. And I think when funders are looking at creating systems of funding and they're putting in, those qualifications that someone has to have, you have to be 18 years old, or like your pre-doc, post-doc, what have you. But when it comes into, and just off the bat, I do agree with everything Joseph said and that Jolene said. So I think we're all on the same page here. But we also, to me, I also want to make sure that, and this is just my own personal thinking, that we're also not in some way, shape, or form gatekeeping that identity. And also that Indigenous people, like, I'm an enrolled citizen of Oneida, but I don't speak for Oneida people. I definitely don't speak for the Oneida people in New York, since I'm Oneida in Wisconsin. But it's what you have to make sure that you're understanding how tribal enrollment works. It became policy virtually after 1934 with the Indian Reorganization Act that tribes had to have some way of having descendancy and enrollment. That's just how the federal government wanted us to work. And it's not that we didn't have systems in place before 1492, but we have to now find ways to work within that system that has been put in place in order to make sure that we are protecting the sovereignty of Indigenous nations and protecting the sovereignty of Indigenous knowledge, to make sure that there's not this extractism that's happening, that does happen a lot in academia. I had it happen last semester. We were requested, I'm a doctoral student, and so one of the books we had to read last semester, I started reading it and I was like, wow, this is a really, really good book. So I looked up the author because I wanted to know if this author had written anything else. And the first thing that pops up on my Google search is a New York Times article about how this author lied about their Indigenous identity and how it came out. And then it makes me stop and think about the knowledge that was placed into this book. Like, it wasn't ethically gathered. They took advantage of, and this book was about sexual trauma and sexual assault. So I'm like, you just took advantage of survivors telling their stories because you lied to them, sadly, about being in Cherokee Nation. And so it was something that is really, really harmful. So I would say to funders and organizations who want to fund people, great, that's awesome. But there's a certain way you've got to go about doing it, because in academia, all of the time it happens. And I feel like people like myself and Jolene and Joseph and other Indigenous academics, we have to work twice as hard, because we've got to put a name out and say, we're doing the work. Why are you not hearing us?
And I was interviewed in that. I know I was interviewed for the New York Times piece.
Okay.
About Andrea Smith and Andrea Smith's book Conquest, right? So I know, yeah. But this is because of a couple of things that I just put in the chat. One is a collective statement by Cherokee scholars about identity, which actually was formulated because of this person that you're talking about, Heather, because of Andrea Smith. And one of the things that I think is important, really important, and really, really, if I may say so, intelligent about this collectively written statement is that an assertion is that it describes an assertion of Indigenous belonging, such as I'm a citizen of, or I am Cherokee, as a public statement of your identity, not a private statement of who you are, but by claiming to belong to an Indigenous nation, you're making a public statement about your professional and political belonging, which therefore means that you are subject to similar types of verification as I have a PhD in Latin American literature, right? That's a verifiable fact. In a similar way, I am Cherokee, at least in this statement, we're describing it as something that is opening you to public scrutiny. And if you don't want that, then you shouldn't claim it. At least this is the determination that we made, back in 2020. And I would say that, yeah, so just like to think through, the statement on sovereignty and identity, I think is one of these things that allows us to, from our own perspective, and this may not be applicable to every nation, obviously, but from our own perspective, this is something that we agreed upon as how we want people to approach Cherokee scholars in this case, because of all of these examples of fraudulent claims to Cherokee identity.
And so it occurs to me that, in research, before we do anything, we have to say, do we have a data set, right? Do we have a baseline? And so we don't have a data set as it relates to how to deal with the 500 plus Indigenous nations in just the United States and how to consider what this is, right? Because on the one hand, we're saying, okay, the federal government has its way of doing this, right? But then we're also saying that as individual nations, or you use the language of tribalism, in Haudenosaunee territories, many of us do not. And so because tribalism has a specific colonial category in the federal government and legal issues. And so we resist that as a sovereigntist perspective. And so that's a need right there. There's a need. I haven't seen a call for a foundation that wants to, do this work, this research in a nuanced way. And why wouldn't we at this point in time, with so many people now presenting, as there's actually a term people are using called pretendians. And so I think there's a need. So that's like a research need. Another thing, and especially as it relates to the arts, I think is this category of what is consultation, because I've seen the museums and large institutions sometimes work in very, and maybe they're doing the best they can. Maybe they think this is the best way to do it. But what is ethical consultation, I think, is really something. And for those people that do it well, I think it's just always a gift when people do it well. But there's a lot of unethical consultation going on, in that not all peoples in our communities are equally informed. And so, again, this is another thing, we're doing the research, and that they're, and for those people that, they may be deeply knowledgeable about our traditions, but they're not the person one would consult for thinking about, something that, is really about, considering Indigenous futurism, or considering, where we're going in the 21st century, and, what this means. I mean, right now, everybody's, stepping over each other to have a discussion about the relationship between Indigenous knowledge and the environment. And, it's, we're reliving that 1970s moment of the crying Indian, who was actually found out to be an Italian actor, not a person, and so there's there's a lot of issues to be dealt with, and how do we tackle them? How do we get at them? I do think foundations and working with peoples that actually are living these experiences, that are actually trying to understand them, and coming from this experience, right? And so I think that needs to be considered. And then I think an expression of sovereignty is that we get to decide who is part of us. And so we all have a mechanism within our cultures to actually bring people in, to welcome people home, to broaden the circle. But that's our sovereigntist right. And so when somebody usurps that role for us, then it diminishes our sovereignty, it diminishes our role. And so, and I'm sure that, people sometimes aren't even conscious that that's what's happened. And so there's, and Heather, this might, it's, this, Joe and Heather and I have discussed this, but, the Northeast is going through this transformation now where it's like they just discovered the Lenape. And everybody's trying to figure it out, and there's a lot of fake organizations that are trying to cash in on this. And people who are well-meaning in the funding community are asking, what do we do? How do we manage this? How do we handle this? And and I think this is, a really big issue, as a people's reemerge and the consciousness of, oh, these are the original peoples of this land, then how can we help? How can we assist? How can we be a part of, the recovery of their place? And so in my work at Cornell, I'm deeply engaged in the recovery of the Gaikono or the Cayuga people to their homelands. But I have to tell you, I've been working at it for 8 years, and it's not something you step into for a 5-month or 6-month period. It takes a long time to understand these things, and I hate to put make it feel overwhelming, but it requires getting to know, what is the notion of traditional leadership? What is the difference between traditional leadership and elective systems? How do artists define themselves within, these populations? And so my kind of measure is that if an artist is unwilling to talk with me about how they're situated, I automatically get suspicious, because if people are confident with how they're situated, they will tell you, or they will find a way to diplomatically help you to understand that. When you feel that you don't understand where this person is situated, you're right, trust your instincts if that isn't crystal clear for you. And I think that's probably like one of the best measures, because if you are looking or trying to work with an artist, a curator, a thought maker, a researcher, a traditional knowledge person, and the tools that you have are that you're understanding, there's the federal registry, there's a state registry, and then there's the traditional mechanism. If those are your tools, and that's all you have access to, but this person cannot locate themselves within any one of those systems for you in a way that helps you to understand it, I think there's a whiff of fraudulence there. And so you could start with that, and then over time, you you develop relationships, just like you do in arts communities, in any arts community. You develop relationships. That's what we do as artists, as makers. We have relationships, right? That's our whole world is really based on that. And so, and you learn those networks, but it gives you, like, to me, that's sort of like a baseline measure that, you know, somebody's coming at you. They could be, you know, an amazing artist. They could be doing the most amazing things. And I'm not suggesting their work isn't of value, but does it fit this particular opportunity and funding category should be, I think, always the ethical question. Because if they're great, they'll be able to find funding anyway. But do they need to take it from this pool that perhaps could be used to actually strengthen a peoples who so much has been taken from us? Let's think about that, right? This place was ours. The Americas were ours. And now we're sharing it with the world. Nobody wants to think about it that way. Is there any other place in the world where the host peoples have been so generous? And I would argue there isn't. There isn't another place in the world where the host peoples have been so generous as us. And so now we're at this moment where I feel like we have a lot of support, a lot of very conscious people who are saying we all have to pull in the same direction. And if we can't really begin to recognize in how to be in balance with Indigenous peoples in the Americas, we're not going to be able to go forward as a place, as a hemisphere. And that's, you know, and that's as basic as it gets, because, you know, there are bigger forces for all of us as human beings than I think these questions, but, you know, it's through these details that we can actually put action to a better, you know, the better life that we all want. And you know, I'm sorry to give the Miss America, the Miss America speech here, but you know, sometimes we do have to telescope back and look at this just for a second from a bigger perspective, because I can tell you that my ancestors have never forgotten for 1 minute what was ours. When I drive around the Northeast with my friends and families, they say to me, oh, that's so-and-so's land, and this is what happened to them, and this, and you know, this used to be so-and-so's land, and you know, I don't think there's any people in the world that forget what's been taken from them.
Yeah.
And so so this is a moment of appropriate rebalancing. Yes. Sorry, Joe.
I love that. I want to go where you're going. I want to be on that train. I want to be there with you.
Yes.
No, Jolene, I was just thinking, like, you know, there are so many different you know, funding organizations from different places. And I think it's important for us to be specific about this. All of you on this call are the beneficiaries of colonialism. Your arts organization is situated on Indigenous land. You benefit from the theft of our land. That is true. It is a fact of a material fact of your existence. Now, what do you do with that knowledge, with that understanding? What does it mean then for you to attempt to relate to the place where you are in an ethical way? There's a question in the Q&A about the Chicago region and prioritizing Indigenous artists, and I think this is a good example. So the question asks, does it make sense to prioritize Indigenous artists living within the geographic region and enrolled in an Indigenous nation? If the funding organization wants to prioritize people from that place, then you need to specify which Indigenous nations are you talking about. If it's just any Indigenous person, then it could be anywhere, right? And so thinking about place and thinking about your relationship to place, you as an organization, you may very well want to prioritize funding groups, organizations who are from the place that you are currently occupying. That would make sense to me. You may want to use that as one of your criteria for prioritizing Indigenous art funding. You may want that in addition or in collaboration with other types of funding for Indigenous organizations across regions or the hemisphere or globally. But you need to think specifically about what your target is. Because if it's just Indigenous people, then, well, you're not actually rooting it in your place. And if you want to root it in your place, then you need to be specific about the types of the specific groups that are from the place where you are.
And just to add to that,
Yeah.
if you're really looking at the Chicago region, Illinois has no federally recognized tribes. So you're going to have to look to see where those tribal nations are today. So you're going to have to do some homework if you're wanting to stick within that particular place-based area. You're going to have to do some homework to find out, okay, is this just to any Indigenous person, like Joseph said, enrolled in a tribe just living in the area, or are you actually looking at the tribal nations that were in that area, because they're not there anymore. So you're going to have to do some work.
And I would also add that, of course, that we don't want to authenticate, right? And that the Chicago area had an incredibly vital diasporic Indigenous community that was, of course, instigated by the relocation that took place in the mid-20th century. And so in New York City, Oklahoma City, Chicago, LA, San Francisco, all have these incredible vital urban histories. And that I think is worthy also of support. That these organizations have been safe landing spaces for Indigenous peoples for 50, 75 years since the relocation projects. And so understanding the role that urban Indian and Indigenous places have played, I think, is also a really important project, because in our communities, we are also struggling to see beyond this notion of the reserved or reservation territory, because many of us view that as actually a win, that at least we were able to reserve these lands for our people. But at that same time, what we also recognize is that that's not enough, that we have to have not only those reserved lands, but we also have to have a way for our young people to feel at home in the broader spaces. And so I'm very appreciative to the work of Indigenous and Native organizations in these urban spaces, because they play a vital role in this kind of like the vitality of this like movement in our communities and territories. So I guess what I'm saying is that within the bizarre space that is the Americas, there's actually an Indigenous America. And that we kind of understand how it moves and transits and works. And that if you want to be part of funding us, that's another kind of conceptual space you'll need to learn, right? Mm-hmm. And it's an interesting space, right? It's an interesting space politically. An idea was put forward, I believe it was in the 70s, called this notion of the fourth world. It hasn't really, got a lot of traction you know, it's like tied up in the Gramscian notion of the first world, third world, you know, the dubious second world. I mean, but this idea that there's actually an indigenous world is really what we're talking about, that we are not, you know, I come from a people that's never been interested in being integrated into the settler state. And so there is sort of like an indigenous world, and it's part of the Americas, but it's also global, and it's a very interesting space, you know, and I would like to invite more people to understand it.
Yeah, I can appreciate that, Jolene. And we, of course, don't have a whole lot of time left in our fireside chat, but in the next iteration of this, I would love to kind of go a little bit deeper, kind of expanding to the global conversation, because there are, as we, you know, preparing for this talked about, there are so many groups that come to the United States and have a very strong presence here. And, you know, they in their original country, they're part of the large indigenous community. And here, okay, well, what happened? And we started to have that conversation. We don't have time right now, but next time we'll get into that. But I wanted to, there are two more questions in the Q&A that I wanted to see if we can start to address. The next one, I dropped it in the chat. If we're working with a tribe, Tongva Nation, fighting for federal recognition on a project that creates space for knowledge and culture creation, as collaborators, how do we prevent false claims to indigeneity while still combating the erasure this indigenous community continues to face? And I think you kind of addressed things like that throughout the presentation, like what you know, the vetting process looked like. You used the brilliant term ethical consultation process, right? Like, what does that look like? So if you have any thoughts on this question, any of you?
I mean, I think there's a new book by Maylee Blackwell that just came out. It's called Scales of Resistance, which is situated in LA on Tongva land. And I think that one of the things that she talks about there is how the largest indigenous group in LA now are sort of indigenous communities from Chiapas, from southern Mexico. And so it's a huge diasporic indigenous population that is not the indigenous population from LA. And so there are frictions there regarding who is indigenous and who is from that place. And I think that, you know, the question needs to first recognize, I think, that your role would be in support of Tongva people's attempts to fight for federal recognition. That's you can't lead that. You can support that, but you need to take their guidance as in terms of what that looks like. It can be tricky. It can be tricky when it comes to, I'm going to use a different example, but sort of like there's a kind of vague Taino diaspora sort of Puerto Rican thing that's been happening more recently. And if you talk to people in the sort of Puerto Rican diaspora, there's a kind of weird reclamation of Taino ancestry, which doesn't actually relate to like extant Taino communities, of which there aren't any. So it's a kind of reclamation of like an echo of a community, which is really weird and challenging, and like I honestly don't know what to do about it. But that's not the same as the Tongva case, in which you have people who are there, who have been there, who have been doing this work for a long time, and who have documented claims to land and relationships with the Spanish colonial state and things like that. So I think that in this case, you need to like listen to what the leaders are saying and ask them what role you can play in support of them.
Great, thank you, Joseph. And I appreciate the acknowledgement of, indigenous groups outside of the United States. You mentioned specifically Taino, and I think there's a lot to unpack there too. And like, even for myself, when we were kind of preparing for this, I made reference to some of my Indigenous family, but I'm just like not as connected with that. And it's just like, what does that mean? Like, I'm aware of it, but I don't go, I don't have a special card. I don't like go around like what does that mean? And what's the connection like there, right? Like how would I kind of navigate that, or like other people? And you mentioned earlier as well, you all were talking about it, like the idea of being a descendant of versus being a part of, or like just flat out lying about being a part of a particular community, or like the Rachel Dolezals of the world, just deciding that you want to pretend to be. And it's just like, there's a lot to unpack here. And I feel like we like just barely scratched the surface, but in a very good way. And so there's more questions kind of coming into the chat, into the Q&A. And I'm going to drop this one in here. But I also want us to kind of get to one of the other ones as well in our 3 minutes left. So this first one is just about the data that you mentioned earlier, Jolene. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think when you made reference to the data before moving forward in any project or research initiative, I think you were acknowledging that when people are going to start working on a project or program, the first thing is like, well, what does the data say? What does the research say? And like, that's what a lot of people tend to lean on before they move forward with something. Is that what you meant by that? Or did I get that wrong? Okay, so I got it wrong. Okay.
No, that's okay. That's good clarification.
Okay.
No, what I'm saying is that I think that we don't have, as a community, as an arts community, as a funding community, a common understanding of what would be the high watermarks, the ethical marks in terms of how to deal with the Tongva, how to deal with the Gaikono, how to deal with the Cayuga, how to deal with the Lenape. And so, we do need a broader kind of research survey about this. We need an opportunity to think it through, and it needs to involve Indigenous people. From these areas, from these communities, there needs to actually be a nationwide discussion about this question by Indigenous peoples on, how it is we are affirming our sense of place, time, identity, and where we think it's going. And I just have never heard of something funded in this way because it serves us, right? But ultimately, it would be an interesting thing, an interesting kind of measure that would begin to look carefully at the sort of fraudulent claims. It would look carefully at the resistance, for instance, nationally and by states, of acknowledging peoples who are trying to reclaim their identity. Because, there has been egregious, erasures of Indigenous peoples in the Americas. And I think the project, which was a big part of it, I was familiar with the Tongva research through the work of Professor Mishona Goman, who was formerly at UCLA, but now she's, we're lucky to have her back here in the Confederacy at the University of Buffalo. But I thought her work becomes an example of how to approach this. I think the work we're doing at Cornell, Kurt Jordan, the American Indian Indigenous Studies program there, is doing around the ethics of, how universities are funded in the Dispossession Project. I think it's good, solid research, and it sets up models for how we can think about this and look at this, to work together to, try to do the best, thing. And so, or, what's best, right? All of this is subjective, I know, but to try and find a way to be responsible to this history.
Yeah.
So that's, I guess, maybe the way I'm thinking about it is how can we be responsible to this history, right?
Yeah.
And I do think we need some, I just think there needs to be more work done on it. And I don't think we can do it alone. I guess that's what I'm saying. I don't think it can be like, I don't think it's an individual scholar's project. I think it's a broader discussion.
Sure. Yeah.
So thanks for pushing me on that.
Yeah, of course. I'm glad I got it wrong so that you could go a little bit. So we have
variation.
Literally no time. But just for the sake of close and for folks who have to drop off, there will be a recording. But for the sake of, kind of wrapping up in closure, quick 30 seconds, 30 only each, 30 seconds, last word that you might want our attendees to hear before they go. Heather, you go first. No pressure.
Go, Heather.
Okay, so I think it's important that people walk away from this webinar feeling that this was just the start of the conversation, because there's so much more that we can go into. And I'm hoping that organizations and funders feel that this conversation was fruitful and that they leave wanting, number one, to know more, but maybe having a better understanding of the complexity that is Indian country. Like it's not as open and shut as people tend to think, but also understanding that we are sovereign nations that deserve the same respect that you would give any other form of government, that we have been here since time immemorial. Our history exists prior to 1492, and that we have so many amazing scholars, writers, artists out there that are deserving of having their work looked at and seen and understood by people. And I'm really just excited to have been part of this with Joseph and Jolene. So thank you. I hope that was 30 seconds.
I'm going to say it was. Thank you for that, Heather. That was fantastic. Joseph?
Yeah, I think that if your arts organization or funding organization does not include Indigenous people as part of your team, as part of the people that you have hired, you need to hire some. I think that if your portfolio of things that you fund doesn't include Indigenous people in a thoughtful, careful, nuanced, and reciprocal way, reciprocity is really important, then you need to figure out how to do it. And so that means treating Indigenous nations as sovereign Indigenous nations, treating peoples as part of these ongoing living collective groups. And it means admitting that you don't know everything when you don't know, and trying to figure out how to get help when you need it.
That's great. Thanks, Joseph. And Jolene, take us home.
Well, I'm going to just swing it in a slightly different way, because what I've been thinking about lately is the role of art for Indigenous peoples, what role it played in our communities. And it was so integral that, back in the 70s, and I'm really dating myself here, but a lot of the senior artists would say, we don't really have a word for art, right? But of course we did, we had lots of words for it because it was like really seamlessly integrated into our lives. And so the sort of like extraction of art, something that is now like fetishistically placed in museums, etc., of which we all really enjoy, is, part of these times. And how could we have like Indigenous centered calls for making, where we begin to really are allowed to not allowed, but where we're really encouraged to think about other ways of doing things beyond this sort of the way that art is thought of today in society. Like, I'd like to kind of, try to get at why are people were decommitted to aesthetic projects, but it wasn't as separate as it is in our world today. And I think it could contribute to all of society if we could inch towards that as a way of living. I think there's something there. So that's it.
All right. Thank you, Jolene. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Heather. Thank you all for your brilliant insights. I'm going to speak for everyone who attended this and say that we are left feeling nourished, saturated, questioning some things, asking some questions, maybe energized to move forward, maybe a little intimidated because it is a lot, but like, if it's not, then like, what are you doing, right? Like, there's a lot that needs to be done. So I can really appreciate that. And I thought this was really fantastic fireside chat. For those who attended, we will be sending out a recording of this, so you'll get all of this brilliance in your hands very soon. There is a survey in the chat. Please click and let us know what you thought. And I know that there are plenty more questions in the Q&A that we didn't get to, but lucky for you, we are sending the contact information out of our presenters, so you can send them an email and ask a question. And it's also about to be on your screen right now. So with all of that, thank you so much for being here once again. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to me, Sherilyn Seeley, at sherilyn@grarts.org. And I hope you have a lovely day. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.